previous lesson, we established the foundation of our world, but we haven't yet talked about what it is that we're actually building. What is the outcome of this process of world building? What is a fictional world made of? Essentially, a world is made of many elements. These could be powerful factions that influence the world, events that shape its history, important locations that the characters could visit, and many other features of the world you build. This lesson is dedicated to these world-building elements. You will learn what they are, how to come up with them, and how to develop them so they fit in with the rest of your world. A world-building element is a specific piece of information on our world. Unlike pillars, which are thematic statements that inform us about themes and narrative constraints of our world, an element is a specific detail in it. The village where the adventure begins, the king of the realm, an order of knights, or the historical war between giants and dragons are all samples of world-building elements. Generally speaking, a world-building element is connected to one or more of the world's pillars. Creating a factions of mages in a D&D world is in tune with the pillars of the game. Its existence will help us establish that the world is magical. However, elements don't have to be connected to pillars. For example, the village of Beginnersville could be a location in our world, and from a brief look at the D&D's pillars, there isn't one that it relates to directly. But that's okay, as long as no pillar contradicts its existence either. A world-building element can also connect to and support other elements. In fact, this is probably the easiest way to develop new elements. If we have a city, one element could be its ruling faction, such as the local duke and his court. Other elements could include the duke's villa and the assassination attempt on his life 2 weeks ago. These elements are all connected. They support each other, but have no particular hierarchy. We could have started from any of them and developed the rest. You can think of elements as puzzle pieces. By writing down the elements of your world, you could see it as one interconnected creation. Elements represent ideas that are as broad and rough as we want. Placeholders that we can develop more later when they become relevant to the setting. Elements include specific factions, events, locations, pantheons, societies, ecosystems, magic systems, settlements, commerce, and many more features of our world. Any element on this list can be useful if you find a way to bring it into the limelight of your setting. Each of these elements can be the topic of an entire lesson, but only a few of them are actually mandatory for you to develop. Factions, events, and locations. We will focus on these for now, but don't worry, you'll have a chance to explore the rest later. As we explore the steps to developing each of these elements, I will be giving you questions to ask yourself along the way. You can find these questions and traits in the world building resource, found in the resources section of this video. So don't feel like you have to write everything I say, though if you want to, I'm not gonna stop you. You do you. Let's start with factions. These are organizations or entities that influence the world and are amongst the most useful things you can build ahead of your game. Examples for factions include a knight order dedicated to a sun deity, a circle of druids that lives in seclusion, and an evil wizard and his minions. You can think of factions like characters on a macro level. This method helps you create tension and conflict in your setting, which we will talk more about in the story design chapter. A question that came to mind when I was writing this lesson was whether or not we should consider gods as factions. What do you think? I think it depends on how active they are in your world. If they are distant gods that rarely answer prayers, then probably not. In an epic game inspired by Greek mythology, then absolutely yes. There are 4 useful traits that we can use in developing a new faction for our world: concept, motivation, activities, and faces. First is the concept. Who are they? Try to define them with a few words. For example, a school of wizardry. Second is the faction's motivation. What drives them? What is their mission? Our school of wizardry wants to govern the magical world. The third trait would be their activities. How are they pursuing their motivation? What are they doing right now? Our school of wizardry wants to govern the magical world, so they teach a generation of wizards, fund researches, and search the world for books and artifacts. Finally, we have the faces. Who can represent the group in front of our players? One of the faces can be the faction's leader, but it doesn't have to be. We could take Fred, a second-year student, or perhaps Agatha, the Dean of Conjuration. And thus, we made a simple faction ready to be placed within the world. The next element we're going to talk about is events, historical occurrences that affected a large portion of your world. Examples include the Great War between humans and Dragonborn, the rising of the old gods, and the discovery of a vault of ancient technology thought to be long lost. Events add color and depth to the world and help us justify how the world evolved to what it is today. In this way, events create the premise for many adventures and even entire campaigns. We'll touch more on premise in the story design chapter, but for now, let's talk about creating events. Like factions, events have 4 traits we should think of during development: concept, participants, location, and outcome. The first one is their concept. What happened? Try to explain the event using only a few words. For example, the crystal isthmus suddenly emerged from beneath the sea. The second trait would be the event's participants. Who was involved? Events can be linked to factions, but don't have to be. The merfolk of Gonkrasar lived in the isthmus before its emergence. The third important trait is the event's location, in both space and time. Where did it happen? How long ago? The crystal isthmus emerged hundreds of years ago and bridged 2 continents. And last but not least, the event's outcome. How did the world change in its wake? The emergence of the isthmus displaced an entire community of merfolk, but provided new land to be claimed by the dwarves of the Brightstone clan. These 4 questions are generally enough to define an event. If you want to expand on it with more information later, we can. But in early stages of development, we don't have to. Our first goal is to understand the outline of our world, and events help us create a timeline that many stories could lean on. The last important element to define before beginning a game is locations. When building your world, you may be tempted to write down every single mountain, city, forest, and ocean, but I encourage you to focus on important locations. And what makes a location important? The impact it has on the settings that you will build. For example, if I were running a game set in Middle-earth, Mount Doom is very important to define, as it is the location of the ultimate goal of the adventure. The Shire is where the adventure begins, and Rivendell is where the characters are heading to find a solution to the ring's problem. Both are important and should be defined ahead of time. Other locations can be developed later, while the characters are traveling through wild areas of the world. If you aren't certain which locations are going to be important, try to come up with at least 2 locations. One in which the party's story will start, and another that they may want to explore. There are many traits we can think of to define locations. We can think of its unique qualities, appearance, terrain, climate, exact place in the world, occupants, history, dangers, valuables. These are all interesting and could be fun to write about, but aren't crucial to begin with. You can develop these traits as needed during the story without harming the location's credibility. You don't have to know what the ancient lost city looks like until the characters arrive there. Nobody knows. Same goes for the treasure that it contains or the dangers that lurk within. So what do you need from the get-go? Only 2 things, actually. The first is the concept, described with a few words, as with factions and events. And the second is the connection. Which other elements or pillars are connected to this location? Perhaps our lost city is connected to a faction of archaeologists who want to excavate it. Or maybe it was the place where the gods finally defeated the primordials in their divine wars. We can't really talk about locations without mentioning maps, because they are a staple of the genre and can be very useful in visualizing the distance between locations. It's also a great way to inspire a sense of exploration in our players. Personally, I really love making maps, but they aren't mandatory for world building. Sometimes it's enough to know there are 2 countries and a nearly impassable mountain range between them. If you want a map for your home game but don't feel like creating one, you can also search the web for fantasy maps and use one of the images that turns up. There are a few maps without any names on them, so you can use a simple editing software to customize them for your personal needs. And if you're interested in creating a map of your own, there are many apps you can use. A current favorite of mine is Incarnate, but I've also used Campaign Cartographer for several years. I've heard wonderful things about Wonderdraft, and Dungeon Fog is considered a very good option as well. You will find links to all of these in the resources section of this chapter. In order to create a coherent world, we need to tie the elements together. So look for natural ways to link the elements you came up with. Sometimes it's easy. A faction can live inside a city, participate in a war, or have a rivalry with some other faction. In other cases, it's less obvious. But we don't have to create a connection between every pair of elements. Simply make sure none of them are left completely isolated. Isolated elements are a sign you should keep developing. Alright, it's time to practice what you've learned. Take a look at the world building elements section of your worksheet for this chapter. This time, you will identify 3 elements in a fictional world: 1 faction, 1 event, and 1 location. For simplicity, I suggest using the same world you chose in the practice on world building pillars. Doing that will also emphasize the connection between pillars and elements. You can use the world building resource document for inspiration. Happy world building! In the next lesson, we'll cover several important guidelines you should keep in mind during the magical process of world building. See you there!